thugs. You need guys to get down to the waterfront and break people's bones and that sort of thing. If you want thugs, you go to the mafia. The same was true in Italy, incidentally, where we had to destroy the working class organizations, and that meant kill union leaders and so on, and the obvious place to do it is to turn to the mafia. Well, the mafia had been pretty well wiped out by the fascists. Fascists tend to run a pretty tight ship, and there was no mafia. And the United States reconstituted it. As the U.S. forces came up through Sicily and in southern Italy, they reconstituted the mafia. And in southern France, the mafia was, the Corsican mafia in this case, was organized and paid off one of the early CIA operations to provide strike breakers and so on to help break up the French labor unions and to ensure something that was important at that time, that France could send arms to Indochina to suppress the Indochinese, what's called the Defense of Indochina by France. It actually is called that, believe it or not, by, say, McGeorge Bundy in his recent book and others. As I said, nothing is too absurd. But the mafia, maybe those guys like to break bones, but they also like to be paid off. And one of the ways of paying them off was allowing them to run the drug racket, which had been essentially destroyed by the fascists. This was done for the Corsican mafia. I expect, although this hasn't been documented, that it was also done for the Italian mafia, which was used to murder union leaders and so on, and part of the background for breaking up the Italian labor movement, which was a serious business. The Italian resistance was a very strong movement, had to put a lot to break it up. The anti-Nazi resistance. Well, that was the origins, apparently that was the origins of the modern international drug racket. That was what became the famous French connection. For a long time, Marseille was the heroin capital. This appears to be a follow-up of this. By the late 1960s, the drug center of the world was apparently shifting over to Southeast Asia, to what's called the Golden Triangle, around Burma and Thailand and that area. And that was connected with CIA efforts to organize what was called a clandestine army. It's called clandestine because the media were able to keep it secret. Everybody else knew about it if you wanted to. But there's this big clandestine army of Highland tribesmen which was organized in classic imperialist fashion, like the British organizing the Gurkhas and so on, like the Contras, in fact, to try to suppress the lowland Lao. Well, that takes money. And the Highland tribes were growing opium, so the CIA came along and took the opium for them and flew it into Saigon, which incidentally led to the destruction of the American army, and that became the drug capital of the world. And that's the way it's gone since then. If you know about the Contras and the drugs and Noriega and all this story, I don't have to tell you about it. And there's a good reason for that. I mean, clandestine covered activities need money. They need untraceable money, and lots of it. And one of the best places to get that money is drugs. So it's natural that clandestine activities, what we should really call international terrorism, because that's exactly what they are. So let's call it that. International terrorism it naturally goes along with state-directed international terrorism, that is large-scale international terrorism, the kind we orchestrate. That does require, it naturally goes along with the drug racket. It's to be expected. And that's why you find this connection, which runs up to the present. And there's never going to be a serious U.S. attack on the drug racket, I don't think, because it's just too integral a part of international activity.
Hi. My name is Peter Schultes. I'm a freshman at American University. Dr. Chomsky, the conclusion I would draw from your talk on the mass media in our society and the role they play is that it's an outcome of the structure of the society itself. I have two related questions. One, what would you say the best way to change the society? What would you say the best way to change it? I'm on the amplifier now. How would you change this society towards something in which necessary illusions don't exist? And secondly, why do you choose not to use widely used Marxist terms in describing the society that exists, replacing terms such as ruling class with ruling elites, general population with working class and that sort of thing. I mean, the other way
Well,
around.
as for the second part, I don't use the terminology because I don't find it very interesting or helpful or useful. In fact, I mean, if you do, okay. I think it's mostly misleading. I'll be frank. I just don't think there's much in the social sciences in the way of theory. I think most of what happens in the world, to the extent that we understand it at all, which is not very much, to the extent that we understand it at all, it's not very much hidden, kind of on the surface. Now, you can obscure it. You can make very complicated theories which make it look obscure, and in fact, I think a large part of the social sciences and the humanities are committed to that for good professional reasons. After all, you got to have a profession and that sort of thing. But I'm just not convinced that the theories help you very much. At least they don't help me very much. Most of the time I don't understand them, for one thing. And what I think I do understand can be described without them. So if you're helped by reading Althusser or something, okay, I'm not. To me, it looks like gibberish. So I don't use it because I don't think it's helpful. If you think it's helpful, fine. As far as, if you talk about these things, theories, the kind that I'm used to, at least, I know about in other fields, which have principles and conclusions and so on. I don't see any of that structure. I should say that the whole idea of Marxism strikes me as kind of odd to begin with. I mean, if there's such a thing, the concept of Marxism belongs to the history of organized religion, just like Freudianism or any other kind of ism. But notice you don't have concepts like that in the sciences, like nobody's an Einsteinian, let's say, or a Planckian or anything like that. And the reason is, in the sciences, people aren't gods. There are people who did some interesting work, maybe important, maybe even revolutionary work. They obviously made mistakes. You try to improve and correct their mistakes. If you're still repeating what somebody said a century ago and trying to figure out why it's exactly true, you know that you might as well throw it out. Nothing that was said a century ago could possibly still look true if there was a field there. I mean, that's kind of like automatic. So if there is a concept like, say, Freudianism or Marxism, it really belongs to the history of theology, in my view. It's raising a human being to divine status. And that doesn't seem to me to make much sense except in theology. If that makes sense. But so that's why I don't use that. As far as I don't mean to say that there aren't insights there. I think in the so-called Marxist literature, I would rather see it called something else. Sure, there are insights, and any sane person ought to learn from them. And I try to do as much as I can, as much as I can understand it. I try to do it. As to changing the society, I mean, I think there are a lot of things to say about that, and I don't want to be glib. I'll just refer to literature. In fact, there's very good literature that I agree with, at least written by people like Robin Hanel, for example, and Mike Albert. So I'll just refer you to their books. I think they give a good, reasonable outline of what a more democratic society, a libertarian society, ought to look like. Now, how do you get there? Well, no big secrets. You get there the way every other big social change in history ever took place. You get there by doing the things that always disturb elites, by being one of these, itinerant preachers and mechanics of the 17th century and running your little printing press and trying to inform people or get them to inform themselves and to organize and to press and to take things over and to run their own affairs and to take over the institutions and so on. That's the way you do it. That's the way social changes have taken place. If there's any other way, nobody has ever invented it. That's the way it's happened throughout history. It's a lot of hard work, but as far as I'm aware, there's no big secrets. Nothing much understood that isn't obvious. I again believe that a lot of the talk about how to do it is a way of defending ourselves from the ugly and demanding task of doing it, and I don't think it's hard to figure that out.
I was wondering if you had any thoughts on the recent effort of the Washington Post and the New York Times to cast President-elect Cristiani in El Salvador as a moderate. And a second related question many people think that there's going to be massive human rights violations on the scale of the early 1980s in El Salvador. Has there been any successful models of media pressure campaigns that have been successful in forcing newspapers like the Washington Post to report these human rights violations as they truthfully occur in these situations, such as might happen in a couple of months?
As for portraying Christiani as a moderate, in my view, that's a little bit like portraying Ronald Reagan as President of the United States. It doesn't really matter much whether he's a moderate or not. He's not the President of El Salvador. The President of El Salvador is who it always was, the armed forces. The only question is who's fronting for them. I think we ought to recognize that. Maybe Christiani's a moderate, whatever that means. Maybe he's nice to his dog or something. I don't know. But that doesn't seem to me the relevant question. The relevant question is, how is the U.S.-run terror system going to respond to the apparently unsuppressible popular organizations that keep popping up every time you decapitate them? Well, one way of responding to that is what's called the Guatemalan solution. You just murder them all. And I guess that's what they'll try